My husband chose my 50th birthday party, the night my friends and family gathered to celebrate me, to hand me divorce papers. What he didn't know was that the next move I made would turn his confident smile into pure panic. My name is Lily Anderson, and I'm 56 years old now. But the story I'm about to tell happened 6 years ago, on a night that started as a celebration and ended with my entire life changing. For most of my adult life, I believed I had a stable marriage. My husband, Robert, and I had been married for 23 years. We had built what looked like a comfortable life from the outside. A quiet house in the suburbs, steady careers, a routine that felt predictable. But sometimes, predictable is just another word for something slowly falling apart. Looking back now, the signs had been there for years. Robert had slowly become distant. Conversations that once lasted hours had turned into short exchanges about bills, schedules, and grocery lists. At first, I told myself it was normal. After all, life gets busy. Work, responsibilities, routines, they have a way of draining the excitement out of things. But the distance kept growing. Robert stayed later at the office. He guarded his phone more carefully, and whenever I tried to talk about how things felt different, he brushed it off. "You're overthinking things," he'd say. Eventually, I stopped asking. Sometimes silence feels easier than fighting for attention. Still, when my 50th birthday approached, my friends insisted we celebrate. "50 is a milestone," my best friend Karen said. "You're not getting away with a quiet dinner." Before I could protest, she had already started planning a small party. Nothing extravagant, just a gathering of friends and family at a cozy restaurant downtown. About 30 people were invited, people who had been part of my life for years. When Karen told Robert about the plan, he surprisingly agreed right away. "Sounds good," he said casually. At the time, I thought maybe he was trying to be supportive. Maybe this was a chance for us to reconnect. Looking back, I realized something else entirely was happening. The night of the party arrived faster than expected. The restaurant was beautifully decorated with soft lights and flowers on every table. When I walked in, everyone shouted, "Surprise!" even though I already knew about it. Laughter filled the room. Hugs from friends, warm wishes from family. For the first hour, everything felt normal. Actually, it felt better than normal. Robert even seemed unusually cheerful. He joked with my friends. He raised his glass during the toast. Anyone watching would have thought we were the perfect couple. But there was something strange about the way he kept glancing at his watch, like he was waiting for something. Eventually, Karen stood up to make a small speech. "Tonight," she said, smiling at me, "we're celebrating one of the kindest people I know." People clapped and laughed. I felt embarrassed but grateful. When Karen finished, Robert stood up. "I'd like to say something too," he announced. Everyone turned toward him. At first, I felt touched. Robert almost never made public speeches. Maybe he had something sweet planned. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an envelope. For a second, I assumed it was a birthday card. But when he placed it on the table in front of me, something about the way he looked at me felt cold. "Happy birthday," he said flatly. Confused, I picked up the envelope. Inside was a stack of legal papers. I stared at the first page, then the second. My heart dropped. Divorce petition. The words blurred for a moment as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Around us, the room had gone quiet. 30 people watched as I slowly looked back up at my husband. "You're joking," I said. Robert shrugged. I figured honesty would be the best gift. A few guests gasped softly. Karen looked horrified. "Robert, this isn't funny," she said. But Robert leaned back in his chair, like he had just finished a simple announcement. "It's not a joke," he replied. He glanced around the table, almost enjoying the shock spreading across the room. "I've been meaning to do this for months." My chest felt tight. "You chose my birthday party?" He shrugged again. "Well, everyone's already here." The cruelty of the moment settled over the table like a thick fog. Some people looked angry, others looked deeply uncomfortable. But Robert didn't seem embarrassed. If anything, he looked confident, like he expected me to cry, or beg, or cause a scene. Instead, I slowly closed the folder of divorce papers. Then I did something that made him blink in confusion. I smiled, not a forced smile, a calm one. "Well," I said quietly, Thank you for being honest. Robert frowned slightly, because that wasn't the reaction he had expected. I stood up from my chair and raised my glass. Everyone, I said, addressing the stunned room, please enjoy the rest of the evening. Then I looked directly at Robert. And don't worry, I added softly. I'll sign the papers tomorrow. The confidence returned to his face instantly. He clearly thought he had just won. What Robert didn't know was that before the next morning arrived, he would call me 78 times begging me to talk to him. After I said I would sign the papers, the room slowly started breathing again. The shock that had frozen everyone in place turned into quiet whispers. Karen leaned toward me immediately. Lily, are you okay? She asked softly. I nodded. I'm fine. But the truth was, I felt something strange inside me. Not anger, not even sadness, just a deep, cold clarity. Because in that moment, I realized something important. Robert hadn't handed me those papers in private. He hadn't asked for a quiet conversation at home. He had chosen my birthday party in front of 30 people because he wanted a performance. He wanted me embarrassed. He wanted people to watch me break down. And the moment I understood that, the pain turned into something else. Strategy. Across the table, Robert had already started chatting with one of his coworkers, like nothing unusual had happened. That was the most shocking part. He truly believed the moment was over. Karen grabbed my arm again. We should leave, she whispered. But I shook my head. No. What? I'm not leaving my own birthday party. For the first time that night, a small smile appeared on my face. If anyone should leave, it's him. Karen stared at me, confused. You're being really calm. I know, because suddenly everything made sense. For years, Robert had slowly distanced himself from me. For years, he had treated our marriage like something he was already done with, and tonight was supposed to be his final victory. But he had made one mistake. He thought humiliating me would make him look strong. Instead, it just showed everyone exactly who he was. A few minutes later, the waiter brought the birthday cake. No one seemed sure what to do. Karen whispered, maybe we should skip the cake. But I stood up again. No, I said. Bring it here. The staff rolled the cake toward the center of the table. Candles lit. Everyone looked uncomfortable, except Robert. He leaned back in his chair, watching like he was curious how I would react. Maybe he expected tears. Maybe he expected me to scream. Instead, I blew out the candles, and people actually started clapping. Weak applause at first, but then louder, because the tension needed somewhere to go. I cut the first slice of cake and handed it to Karen, then the second slice, then the third. Eventually, the room started talking again. The party slowly returned to life. Music started playing again, drinks were refilled, and Robert began to look slightly confused, because instead of becoming the center of drama, he had become the most awkward person in the room. People were avoiding his table. A few guests gave him cold looks. Even his coworkers seemed uncomfortable. At one point, he leaned toward me. You're taking this pretty well, he said quietly. I looked at him calmly. What reaction were you expecting? He smirked slightly. I figured you'd make a scene. I took a sip of my drink. Well, that would have made you feel important. His smile faded a little. The rest of the party passed in an oddly peaceful way. People told stories. We laughed. For the first time in years, I felt something strange. Freedom. Around 10 o'clock, Robert finally stood up. I'm heading out, he said to the table. No one protested. He looked at me. So, tomorrow we'll finalize things. I nodded. Sure? He picked up his coat, then hesitated. You're really okay with this? I tilted my head slightly. Why wouldn't I be? That question clearly bothered him. He stared at me for a moment, like he was trying to read something in my face. Then he shrugged. Good night. And just like that, he walked out of the restaurant. The moment the door closed behind him, Karen leaned toward me again. Lily, what are you planning? I smiled slightly. Nothing tonight. But tomorrow? I looked down at the divorce papers still sitting beside my plate. Robert thought he had just ended our marriage on his terms. What he didn't realize was that I had just discovered something that would completely change the situation, and by the time he figured it out, his phone would be ringing 78 times trying to reach me. That night, after the party ended, Karen insisted on driving me home. Are you sure you don't want to stay at my place? She asked as we pulled into my driveway. I'm sure, I said calmly. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Quiet, peaceful, but something about it already felt different. Robert's car wasn't in the driveway. That meant he had gone somewhere else after leaving the restaurant. Karen turned off the engine and looked at me carefully. "You're scaring me a little," she admitted. "Why?" "Because you're too calm." I smiled slightly. Maybe I'm just tired. But the truth was something else entirely. After Robert handed me those divorce papers, my mind had started connecting a few things that never made sense before. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Robert had made a serious mistake. Karen hugged me before leaving. "Call me if you need anything," she said. "I will." When I walked into the house, the silence wrapped around me. For a moment, I stood in the living room remembering the past 23 years, the furniture we picked together, the photos on the wall, the quiet routines we had built. It should have felt heartbreaking, but instead, I felt clear. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Then I opened the folder of divorce papers again. Robert had clearly prepared everything carefully. The documents were detailed. Assets, property, financial agreements. He had even included a proposed division of the house, and that's when I noticed something interesting. Very interesting. Because according to Robert's plan, he expected to keep the house. He expected to keep most of the savings. And he expected the divorce to move quickly, almost like he was confident nothing would challenge his plan. I leaned back in the chair slowly, because suddenly I remembered something from 2 years earlier. A conversation Robert and I had with our financial advisor. At the time, Robert had been strangely uninterested in the details. He barely paid attention during the meeting, but I had. Especially when the advisor explained something important. Something Robert apparently forgot. I walked over to the small office room in our house and opened my laptop. After a few minutes of searching through old emails, I found the document I was looking for. My heart started beating faster because the information on the screen confirmed exactly what I suspected. Robert had just made a huge mistake, and he didn't even realize it yet. I closed the laptop and laughed quietly to myself, not because the situation was funny, but because of the irony. Robert had tried to humiliate me in front of 30 people. He thought serving divorce papers at my birthday party would make him look powerful, but instead, he had accidentally given me the perfect opportunity. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight filled the bedroom. For the first time in years, the house felt strangely peaceful. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the divorce papers again. Then I picked up my phone. There was already one message from Robert. "Let me know when you're ready to sign." Short, cold, exactly the way he usually communicated these days. I didn't reply. Instead, I called someone else, my lawyer. Her name was Diane Foster, and she had helped me with a small property issue a few years earlier. She answered after the second ring. "Lily? Good morning." "Good morning, Diane. You sound serious. I think I might need your help." Within an hour, I was sitting in her office. She read through the divorce documents carefully, occasionally raising her eyebrows. Finally, she looked up at me. "So, he gave you these at your birthday party?" "Yes." "In front of everyone?" "Yes." Diane leaned back in her chair slowly. "Well, that's certainly dramatic." I nodded. "But here's the part you should see." I slid another document across the desk, the one I had found the night before. Diane read it. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at me with a surprised expression. "Oh, wow. That's what I thought," I said calmly. Diane smiled slightly. "Your husband clearly forgot about this." "Apparently." She tapped the document with her finger. "If this information becomes part of the divorce proceedings," I finished the sentence for her. "His entire plan falls apart." Diane nodded. "Completely." For a moment, we both sat there in silence. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. "What would you like to do?" I thought about Robert sitting somewhere confidently, believing everything was under control, believing he had already won. Then I smiled. "Let's respond to his divorce papers." Diane returned the smile. "I had a feeling you might say that." That afternoon, Robert called me for the first time. I didn't answer. Then he called again, and again, and again. By the time the sun started setting, my phone had already recorded 20 missed calls, and Robert still had no idea why his perfect divorce plan was about to collapse. By the end of that afternoon, my phone had 20 missed calls from Robert, and 5 text messages. The first one was calm. "Lily, call me back so we can talk about the paperwork." The second one sounded slightly impatient. "Why aren't you answering?" The third message came an hour later. "This doesn't need to be complicated. I stared at the screen for a moment before placing the phone face down on the table. For 23 years, Robert had controlled almost every important decision in our marriage. Finance, property, even small daily choices. But today, for the first time, I wasn't rushing to respond, and it clearly made him uncomfortable. Across the desk from me, Diane was typing something on her computer. After a moment, she looked up. "Your husband seems nervous already." I smiled slightly. "That's only the beginning." She nodded. "Once he sees our response, he'll understand why." Because Robert had forgotten something extremely important. 2 years earlier, when we restructured our finances, a large portion of our assets had been moved into an account connected directly to my name. At the time, Robert barely paid attention during that meeting. He had been checking his phone and nodding without really listening. But legally, the structure of that account changed everything. If the divorce proceeded the way he planned, he wouldn't just lose the house, he would lose access to most of the savings he thought he controlled. Diane finished typing and turned the monitor slightly toward me. "This is our formal reply to his petition," she explained. I read the document carefully. Every line was precise, professional, and devastating to Robert's carefully planned divorce. When I finished reading, I looked up. "Send it." Diane clicked the mouse once. Done. It was that simple. Just one email to Robert's lawyer. And suddenly, his confident plan no longer existed. I drove home slowly that evening, enjoying the quiet road and the warm sunset. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anxious about going back to the house, because Robert wasn't there, and maybe he wouldn't be again. When I arrived home, my phone buzzed again. "Robert." I ignored it. 2 minutes later, it rang again, then again. By dinner time, the missed calls had reached 37. Karen called next. "Lily, what did you do?" she asked immediately. "What do you mean?" "Robert just called Mark." Mark was Karen's husband. "And?" He sounded completely panicked. I leaned back in my chair. "That was fast." Karen laughed nervously. "Lily, seriously, what happened?" I explained the financial situation briefly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Karen burst out laughing. "Oh my God. What?" "He really thought he was humiliating you at your birthday party. Apparently. But now he's the one in trouble." I looked at the quiet house around me. Yes. A moment later, my phone buzzed again. Robert. This time he left a voicemail. I pressed play. "Lily, we need to talk," his voice said urgently. "This isn't what we discussed." I raised an eyebrow. "We never discussed anything." "He served divorce papers in the middle of my birthday party," the voicemail continued. "My lawyer says there must be some mistake with the financial documents." I almost laughed. There was no mistake, just information Robert had ignored. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. But Robert clearly didn't, because when I woke up the next morning, my phone showed something unbelievable. 78 missed calls. 78, along with dozens of text messages, some confused, some angry, some desperate. The last message, sent at 3:42 a.m., simply said, "Lily, please call me." I stared at the screen quietly. 6 years ago, I would have rushed to comfort him. I would have tried to fix the situation, but things were different now. Because Robert had chosen the stage, he had chosen the audience, and he had chosen humiliation as his method. What he never expected was that the final act of his performance would end with him begging for a conversation. When I saw the 78 missed calls, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel satisfied either. Mostly, I felt calm. For years, Robert had been the one in control of everything in our marriage. Now, suddenly, he wasn't. I placed the phone on the kitchen table and poured myself a cup of coffee. Outside, the morning sun was shining through the windows. It was quiet, peaceful. Then the phone rang again. "Robert." For a moment, I considered ignoring it like the others, but something inside me said it was time, so I answered. The moment I said, "Hello," Robert's voice exploded through the phone. "Lily, finally!" He sounded exhausted, like he hadn't slept all night. "We need to talk," he said quickly. "I agree," I replied calmly. There was a short pause. "Why didn't you answer my calls?" he asked. "You called 78 times. I was trying to fix this." "Fix what?" I asked. "The paperwork, the financial documents. Something's wrong." I took a slow sip of coffee. "Nothing is wrong, Robert." "Yes, it is." he snapped. My lawyer said the accounts are structured differently than I thought. That's correct. Another silence filled the line. Then his voice lowered. You knew about this? Yes. Why didn't you say anything before? I almost laughed. Before when? Another pause. You know what I mean. No, I said quietly. I don't. Robert exhaled loudly. Look, maybe we rushed into this divorce thing.